Welcome back. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at is metering. So the different metering modes that are available in your camera and how metering works. And the reason we need to know this is so that we can get the correct exposure when we start shooting in manual. The video after this, we're going to start talking about shutter speed and how that works. But then as I was making the video, I'm like, oh gosh, I better make the metering video first. Because if I teach you how to use your shutter, you won't understand how to meter your camera to get the correct exposure and have everything turn out. Now, you are going to struggle with this. This is going to take you time in learning how to make the correct adjustments when taking a photograph. So the first thing that we're going to take a look is down here. We're going to look at this where I have matrix 60/40, center weighted 10 degrees, and spot 1 to 3 degrees. Now, these are three simple basic metering modes. Not every single camera manufacturer uses the exact same terminology, but they're using the same idea. So if I explain what's going on, you're going to be able to set the correct metering mode. Now, by default, almost everybody's going to be using this kind of 60/40 split matrix mode, where you're metering basically the entire frame. And truthfully, because you have the ability to see your exposure or your image on the back of your camera, this is much easier than when you shot film. When you shot film, you had to really make sure you got your exposure correct because you had no image on the back, so you had to make sure that this was exact. And when you did that, you had to switch between these metering modes. Now you don't really necessarily have to switch between the different metering modes as much because you can see what's going on in the back of your camera. Let's take a look at these different modes. Now the main mode and what is most likely going to be default, and this is Nikon's terminology, it's called matrix. And basically it's an average metering system, meaning there's a 60/40 split. So what happens is in your viewfinder, the center 60% of your image is what the camera is looking at to meter for your exposure. Now, a camera is set up and it meters an 18% gray, not white, not black. So a meter is set to meter off an 18% gray. And you'll see things called a gray card pop up. And a lot of old school photographers would meter off a gray card that was 18% gray. And that would help you get the exact exposure. The way this works is what we'll do is we will switch over to an image real quick. So we have this image here. And the way this works is a camera is going to take this 60% in the center portion and give it more weight than the 40% out here. So it's looking here for a majority of it, and this it's finding to be less important. Now it's looking at the whole situation, but it's taking an average in the meter. Now, this is a good example of an image. Remember, a camera is looking for 18% gray. Well, most of the values in this image are much darker than 18% gray. By nature, your meter is going to give you a false reading. It's going to actually have you slightly overexpose this image. Well, why? Because there's more dark values. So if you have a lot of dark in an image, you're going to tend to overexpose your image if you go by your meter. If you have a lot of white in your image, you're going to tend to underexpose or make it too dark because you have too much white in the image. Well, why? Because it's looking for that balance of that 18% gray. That's what matrix metering is doing. It's a weighted measuring system, and it's weighting. It's giving more emphasis on the center 60% than the outer 40% of your frame. And then it takes an average. And then as you adjust this, that's how you get your exposure. Center weighted only looks at like a 10-degree spot, and different camera manufacturers might vary a little bit, but we're just going to say 10 degrees for sake of this video. It is weighting the center portion and it's not looking out here. So what this allows you to do is put it on a specific area. So if you had a lot of black out here, but you wanted to meter for someone's face, you could use a center weighted measuring system if you were up close and put this on their face. And that's going to give you a better idea of the correct exposure, because if you metered all this black, it's accidentally going to overexpose. And then here you have a spot metering mode where it's like a 1 to 3 degree spot, and you, whatever specific area you put that little dot on, that's where you're going to get your meter. So if you needed to meter a very specific spot in your frame, that's what spot metering would do. Truthfully, I don't move it anymore because I just look on the back of my camera and I can adjust from there. So those are your 3 different metering modes. There should be a place on either in your camera's menu or on your camera that's going to allow you to switch between different metering modes. Now, your modes might vary. You might have 3, you might have 4, but basically this is what's happening in your camera. This is how your camera meters. Now, the next thing that we have to look at, and you might see this on the back of your camera. Now, you're only going to see the numbers. So you're going to only see this -2 to +2. You're not going to see all these other words, and you're going to see a little dot right here that moves. So this is going to move as you adjust your camera. If you don't see this, it's because you're so far off your exposure, it's like way past this or way past this. This is telling you when you have, or when the camera thinks you have the correct exposure. When the little line that moves, and we're assuming that this red line is the one that moves, when it's at 0, that means you have the correct exposure according to the camera. That doesn't mean that you have the correct exposure. That's just what the camera thinks is the correct exposure. This is really important. I find that the camera's meter is incorrect about 50% of the time. Now, it's not usually incorrect a lot. It could only be like 1/3 of a stop or 2/3 of a stop, but you will find that your meter is incorrect a lot of the times. And that really just depends on what I was talking about before, where you have a lot of black or a lot of white or something funky going on in your image that causes your meter to be incorrect. We have this little tick is for -1/3. This is -2/3. And then -1. In photography, most things go in full stops. So this is a full stop. This is a full stop. So this is -1, -2 from an even exposure. This is +1, +2. This is +1/3, 2/3, 1 1/3, 1 2/3. So you're going to see this number. You might see -2. You might even see a -3. But basically, you're going to have some sort of scale in your camera. And as you adjust this, you're trying to get this little red dot to line up on the 0. Now, you just can't randomly adjust the numbers and expect everything to work out. You have to understand aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, because just because you set something and you get the correct exposure, that doesn't mean that the actual image is going to turn out correctly. You could have your shutter speed way too slow and your image is totally going to blur. So where you had the correct exposure, your image isn't going to work because your shutter speed is too slow. So there's multiple aspects that you have to look at or understand with your camera when you're taking an image than just getting the correct exposure. So if this little guy here is in the minus section, which is this whole section, it is called underexposed, meaning that the image is going to be too dark. And if you're in the plus section, that is called overexposed, and that image is going to be too bright. If you are unsure, you are better off to be slightly underexposed than slightly overexposed. And this is the reason why. If you overexpose and blow out a highlight, so if you have a very bright white and it has a little bit of detail in it, if you overexpose it and you lose that detail, you can't get it back. But if you make it too dark, you can kind of open that up. So I feel on the side of caution, if you're unsure about your exposure, being a little bit dark is better than being a little bit bright most of the time. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come and we are going to take a look at some different images. And those images are going to be an even exposure. And then we're going to see a -1, a -2, a +1, and a +2. So you can see what the difference is between over and under exposing your image. All right, so this is our even exposure, meaning that this is the image that I found to be a perfect exposure. Now, it might look a little bit dark to most of you, but remember I said, err on the side of caution and shoot on the dark side, not the bright side. You look at this bright highlight here, or this bright highlight here. The sun's rising here at the beach. And I don't want to blow out this area and make it totally white, because if I do that, this is where my eye is going to go. Your eye is always going to go to the brightest area of the image. And the other fact is there's just a lot of dark things. So this is the backside of the horse. The horse is getting lit from the other side. So it's going to be dark. And I'm using this to add depth to the image, right? The sun isn't hitting the side of the horse. It's hitting this side of the horse. If we look here in the sand, we are out of focus. And when you're out of focus, the camera doesn't hold highlight values as well. So I don't want to blow this out or make it too bright, because I'm going to end up with this big white area. I'm erroring a little bit on the side of dark. It is a little bit too dark, but my image is just dark. So it's okay to have a darker image because everything in the image is darker. This is my even exposure. So we're going to go to the next image. And this is -1. What this would be is an exposure where I'm one stop underexposed. So it's going to be too dark. So you can see how way too dark this is. And then this is going to be an example of 2 stops underexposed. This is going to be an example of 1 stop overexposed where it's too bright. You can see here, see where we're starting to lose some of this detail here in the sand, and this is getting too bright. Remember I said you're better off to slightly expose something too dark than to too bright. I don't want this to get too bright. I can even this stuff out as I'm toning or adjusting the image, but this is just a little bit too bright. And this is +2, meaning it's 2 stops overexposed. So if we go back to the metering system, you could see we had even, we had -1, -2, +1, and +2. Now, the way you get the correct exposure is most likely what you're going to do is you need to get your ISO in the right spot. And just so I can give you a little example, it's bright and sunny outside, usually between an ISO of 100 or 200 is going to work. If it's cloudy, you want to start your ISO at about 400. If it's a really dark and cloudy day, maybe you want to start it at 800. And if you're inside and you have lighting, your ISO is usually going to start up around 1600 and go up from there. So the first thing you need to do is set your ISO. 100 to 200 for sunny, cloudy between 400 and 800, depending on how cloudy and how dark, and then 1600 and up for dark situations. That's just getting your camera so that your other adjustments, which are your shutter speed and your aperture, can get you the right exposure. So it's important that you kind of put your ISO in the right spot to allow you to get the correct exposure on your camera. Now, remember, when you're adjusting this, if you don't see this little dot, and this could be red, it could be black, or it could be green. I've seen them all those 3 different colors. Something in there is going to move. If nothing is moving, you are so far off on your exposure that you need to make a dramatic adjustment to kind of get this. But once you start seeing it blink towards the edges, then you know you're starting to get close. And then you're going to do some sort of combination of your shutter speed and your aperture. And once you learn how to do it, you're going to have very specific settings, because that's going to allow your camera to take very specific photos using aperture and shutter speed. So this is how you use the meter inside of your camera. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.